Africa is an enormous continent, fully 4 times the size of the 48 states of the United States. It is populated by enormously warm, hospitable, kind, and creative people. The African peoples have made enormous contributions in literature, music, and the arts to world culture. Nigeria is an enormous country, inhabited by dozens of individual peoples who have contributed to world culture as well. Just like the rest of Africa, Nigeria has made tremendous contributions in the fields of literature, music, and the arts. In this video, I would like to share with you the creativity of several Nigerian potters. I took the photographs during a research trip to Nigeria in 1991 when I worked in a Yoruba village named Ooko, south of Ibadan, and visited the Yoruba Dada compound in the city of Ilorin in northern Yoruba country. I also include photos taken among the Gwari people north of the confluence between the Benue and the Niger River, and in Benin City in southern Nigeria. The video was made in 2010 by my friend and colleague Professor Chris Acheda from the Technical College in Calabar, southern Nigeria. Potters begin by preparing clay. Clay and dirt are 2 very different things. Clay is finely levigated mineral material that is mixed in different proportions by nature and can be used to make pottery and bricks and a variety of other useful materials. Dirt, soil, earth are decomposed vegetable material that is very useful for growing crops, but cannot be used for making pottery. The difference is essential. Igbo potters, like potters everywhere else, find sources of good clay, which they mine very carefully, finding sources that have just the right mix. Clay can include a whole variety of minerals, ranging from white porcelain clay to red iron-rich clay. Each of these mixes produces a different kind of pottery. Some of it is white porcelain, others are low-fired red earthenware. Both of these products are useful. The people who are digging clay pile up their clay and protect it with plastic tarps and keep it safe during the rainy season so that they can come back and retrieve it. They're pulling clay lumps out to stack and take back home to pound up to make the clay that they'll use for making pottery. As you can hear, it has started to rain. The women have loaded the clay on tops of their heads and are returning to the village with the dry clay that they'll then use to make new pots. She said that because it's raining, the people who are digging clay pile up their clay and protect it with plastic tarps and keep it safe during the rainy season so that they can come back and retrieve it. The dry clay is then mixed or slaked with fresh water until it attains the right consistency to be kneaded together with the grog. This potter is grinding up potsherds, broken pieces of pottery from a previous firing, to turn them into a powder which is then sifted and kneaded into the fresh clay. By adding this temper or grog to the fresh clay, the amount of shrinkage in the new pot is reduced, and the risk of cracking during the firing is also reduced.
Florence.
Okay. 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 Yes, he's talking about sieving. After crushing it on the wood.
After the potsherds have been crushed, they have to be sifted to separate the larger chunks from the fine grog material. The larger chunks then can be repounded and reduced.
Okay.
She sweeps the ground clear, especially to remove any organic material that she doesn't want to be mixed in with the clay. She then places the fresh clay on the ground, mixed with the grog that she's pounded up, more fresh clay, more grog, and then she kneads it all together using her foot. You can see here she spreads a layer of grog on the ground first, then dumps fresh moist clay on top of that, and then puts more grog on top of the fresh clay. They have to get just the right mixture of grog, which they call uma, and fresh clay. If they have too little, it can endanger the pot during the firing. If they have too much that they've added, it can also endanger the pot during the firing and cause it to break. They're testing the clay with their fingers to see if there's enough grog mixed into it. They're going to make a demonstration pot for us, and they're looking through their collection of tools to find the tools they need to form the pot properly. Most of the materials you see being used for tools are found objects, pieces of broken gourd, calabash, shells, roughly carved paddles, various other materials that are inexpensive to make. The base on which the pots are formed are the broken necks from older pots. Some of these are pots that have been broken in use, some of them are pots that have been broken during the firing. They're turned upside down to form the supports for the new pots. She begins by making a coil by rolling fresh clay between her hands. She then forms the new pot, holding it in her left hand while she uses a coil in her right hand. She forms the base of the pot, rotating the base with her fingers and kneading the coil of fresh clay into it with her right hand as the pot grows. This is really one of the most remarkable tour de force demonstrations of pottery manufacture that I think I've ever seen. As soon as she has built this new pot up large enough to form a base, she places it in one of the broken necks of old damaged pots, and then she begins the coiling process. This is the very same coiling process that potters use all over West Africa and many other parts of Africa. She places her left hand on the outside of the new pot, and using her right hand she holds the coil on the inside of the pot and compresses the coil against the palm of her left hand at the same time that she presses it against the lower layer of pottery. As she goes around, she rotates the pot, slowly building the sides up, adding new coils as necessary, adding fresh material from time to time, increasing the sides of the pot. All of the years of experience and all of the skill she's acquired makes it possible for her to build a uniformly round spherical pot simply by pressing the clay from her right hand into her left. This is not at all easy to do. This is the result of years and years of experience, and a very, very deft touch. She has picked up a tool which she calls Untitled, which she'll use to paddle the rim of the new pot to consolidate it and even it out so that she can then continue with the next step in the forming. She dips the paddle or unchiri in a little bit of water so that it won't stick to the fresh clay as she paddles the rim. Her mother, Madame Evan, is providing her with fresh coils of clay so that as she works she doesn't run out of clay to form the new pot. She kneads the fresh clay very carefully to be sure that it is consistent. As the pot grows in size and weight, they transfer it from a smaller stand made of a broken pot neck to a larger stand that will support the weight bit. Now they demonstrate the way they make the flange for the Ooko pot. She adds another coil of clay to complete the circumference around the pot. She uses the paddle to level and consolidate the rim. Now she uses a second tool, a block of wood, which she carefully cleans of dry clay. She'll use this to flare the rim. Again, as always, she works with her right hand inside the pot and supports the rim of the pot, the exterior, with her left hand. This third tool is a broken coconut shell. This is another Ooko pot. The inside has been smoothed and now it's ready to have the exterior smoothed. Now she'll use a leaf that she's soaked in water. The leaf is called upere, and she'll use this to smooth the rim. The rapidity with which the potters work is truly remarkable. At this point, she's only been working on this pot for about 15 minutes. This narrow groove around the inside rim of the pot gives definition to the shape of the pot. At this point, she needs to set the pot aside for a little while to dry out under the sun before she adds the decorative coil with notches around the edge of it. While she is waiting for the first pot to solidify a little bit, she applies slip to the interior and to the exterior of pots that she's already created. This slip is just watery clay that has been soaked into a rag. She wipes the rag across the outside and inside of the pot. The slip will fill in any of the spaces or gaps or cracks or fissures or bumps in the pot, and then she can smooth it all out by rubbing it with a stone. The application of slip to the pot can actually provide a little bit of color variation, because if she uses clay with a higher or lower iron content, it will make the clay slip slightly redder or slightly less red than the body of the pot itself. Now she burnishes the interior of the pot with a round pebble. This process consolidates the clay and smooths it to provide a nice, smooth interior for cooking. The pebble is called Gwari. The pottery bases that are used to support the pots while they're being shaped can either be large pieces of pottery that was broken in the firing, or they can be specially formed pots that were made specifically to be used as bases. Here Madame Even is producing a much larger jar using the coiling technique. Mrs. Even is thickening the rim of the large pot. Just as with the smaller Ooko pot, she uses the paddle to consolidate and flatten the rim. She uses a piece of broken coconut shell to smooth the interior of the pot. They carefully move the large pot from the stand that has supported it to a larger stand that will support the increased size of the jar. She has found a bit of stone in the clay body. She removes it and smooths it over. This is Mrs. Even Chukwu's sister and her daughter. All of the women in the family are potters in some way. Some of them go to the clay pit to gather the clay to bring in. Some of them form the pots. Some of them help with the firing, but everybody participates.
Okay. So she's saying that actually when a woman has a child, she aspires that the child, a female child, should mature and get married around the neighborhood so that she can be taught how to make pots. But the ones that marry afar, in another area, another state, they don't do it. They just go and that's it. So she's happy that this one married around. She taught her and she actually got it and she's doing it. How about the boys? So in this community, boys don't do pottery.
But they help in getting firewood.
Okay, they can only be useful in fetching firewood, the necessary levels of fire making instruments. The thick one, the grass, they can go and cut and bring, but the actual potting, they don't. They can also pound and crush the grog, mba. They can crush it. But beyond these things, the women take over.
Here Mrs. Joy Chukwu is making a fine coil of clay that she'll add around the exterior of the pot. She carefully places it and smooths it, and then with the tip of her forefinger she makes dents in it to create a texture.
She says that she's about to start designing the neck of that Ooko that is on her laps.
She says once she has added the ring of clay to the exterior of the pot, she can use her fingers or tools to produce any kind of pattern that she likes. She smooths the coil out with a leaf. Even the most simple poke with the tip of a forefinger produces an elegant design.
She's completed it. She can put another one or not, depends on the temperament, design temperament of the potter. Yes. Yes. Okay.
They have been making this pottery for a long, long time. Making pottery is part of their heritage. Any woman who marries into this community has to begin to make pottery. These mounds are where the earth has been piled up by the women for planting crops. The women gather firewood and other burnable materials from all over the forest. One of the materials they use are the fibers of the oil palm, which are very flammable. The potters also use large boulders dug from termite mounds, which are used as chairs or supports for the pots to keep them off the ground during the firing, to raise them above the level of the ground so that hot ash and hot air can get underneath the pots.
More pots are coming from the store.
The women carry the pottery out of the storeroom, where it's been kept dry, and gather it around the firing area. They pile it up on a layer of dried palm fronds to keep it away from the moist ground. A layer of ash also keeps the pottery away from the wet earth.
It's a communal thing here. Other potters will bring their pots for firing, and they will join forces to make it work better. She's saying that these porous things she's laying is setting the stage for the layout of the pots. Now she's putting from the bag, taking from the bag, the fibers from palm fruits. After making the palm oil, the fibers that remain, they are dried and used to cause fire to come into play. It catches fire easily.
The potter brings bundles of dried flammable grass from the forest and chops it up to use as fuel for the firing. The potters carefully arrange the lumps of termite clay with the materials that will be used for the firing. One of the principal materials are the fibers from the oil palm, which is so flammable. The first pot is carefully placed on the lumps of termite clay, and fuel is arranged around it. The potters carefully arrange the pottery and the fuel to make sure that there is an even firing, that the fuel is distributed evenly enough so that all areas of the firing become equally hot. They start the fire using what they call local candles, which are bundles of palm fiber that have been twisted up and which are very flammable. As soon as the fire has started, they place a second layer of pots on top of the first layer.
Why is it black now? Okay, so when you put, she's saying that after putting something on top of it, this blackness will disappear towards maturity. As it matures, the blackness, the carbonization of the material will disappear. That one will signal the maturity of the pot.
At this point, the firing has progressed to the point that the pots are quite warm, and the danger of thermal shock as additional fuel is added has been reduced. The women suddenly begin to add large amounts of fuel to the outside of the firing. First dried palm fronds, and then dried grass from the bush. Almost immediately, the fire flares up, increasing the heat dramatically. All of the potters work together rapidly to add fuel to the fire. At this point, it is still a reduction firing. There is a lot of fuel and not very much oxygen, and the pottery will be black. A reduction firing is pretty much signaled by all of the smoke that emerges. But as the fuel is consumed, the amount of oxygen and heat increase, and the pottery turns red.
Why are you resting? Okay. Okay, she's saying that this is a time for rest for them. They have done all the things they want to do. They're just looking at the combustion process, watching it very carefully from their resting places, that they're anticipating the majority of the wares. And if they, for instance, they go and look at it and they suspect lack of maturity one way or the other for lack of uniformity, they are yet to do something to make up for that problem. Okay. Okay, so she's saying that I was asking why they didn't count the pieces before firing. But she said it's not necessary because they actually do not know which one will survive and which one will not survive. That is, it is at the harvesting after the firing that they will now count the ones that are successful and the ones that are not successful.
At this point, it looks like a very successful firing. The fuel has been consumed. The pottery is covered with a bed of hot ash. The pots are soaking in the heat and rapidly turning red. The potters have been working constantly for at least an hour and a half, and it's time to rest. They're sitting down watching the firing come to an end. The pots and the ash are still very, very hot.
The cinders have gone down, revealing openings. We now have full visual access into the system. Using the broom to wall up the cinders, the ash.
It's time to pull the pots from the fire. They're so hot that they have to be handled with a cloth to keep from burning the hands.
Starting from the top to prevent collapse of the system.
The rim of one pot on the far side of the firing has broken slightly. That'll either be smashed up to make grog or sold at a reduced price.
Makiva, did we get it? You got what you wanted, yes.
The women are really happy with the results of the firing. The vast majority of the pots have come out of the firing undamaged and can be sold at a good profit.
She's dancing, she's happy. She's happy.
Mrs. Chukwu is so happy with the results of the firing that she's dancing and laughing at the same time. These are examples of some of the beautiful pottery that Igbo women are able to produce. The designs on the outside are very linear, very much like the uli painting that Igbo apply to their bodies. There's a contrast between darker areas and red areas. The darker areas have been reduced, the red areas are oxidized. These are very ancient designs. They're very similar to the designs on the remains of pottery that have been found in burials like that at Igbo Ooko, dating back to the 10th century AD.
So this is a part of the collection of the quality of technical input in the clay.
The Gwari people live just north of the confluence of the Niger and Benue rivers in central Nigeria, south of the new national capital at Abuja. They are famous for the quality of their pottery. And they have been famous for a long, long time. During the colonial period, the English potter Michael Cardew set up a pottery in a town called Abuja, north of the confluence, where he taught a number of excellent Gwari potters Western pottery techniques, including glazing. and introduced machinery to process the clay and new kiln shapes. One of his most famous potters was the Gwari woman named Ladi Kwali, who traveled through the United States and other parts of the world for many years in the 1970s. When the government of Nigeria decided to build a new capital in the center of the country, they appropriated the name Abuja from the small village where Cardew and Ladi Kwali had worked and transferred it to the new capital. The old village was renamed Suleja, and the pottery that Cardew established still operates in Suleja. Among the Gwari, as among every other people in Africa, pottery begins by gathering raw clay and processing it, pounding it, drying it, soaking it in water, adding pounded potsherds as grog to decrease shrinkage, and then kneading it to form a body that can be used to make the pottery. Here a young potter works with a baby on her back. She kneads the clay with a pestle and then chooses the tools that she'll use to form the new jar. She kneads the clay carefully so that it is uniform and to be sure that there are no foreign materials, either vegetable material from the ground or stones or other objects that would damage the pottery. She uses the direct pull technique. This is quite a different technique than that used by Yoruba or Igbo potters. She turns a wooden mortar upside down to use as a support for the new jar so that she can work upright. She forces her fist into a mass of fresh clay and begins to work it upward with the fingers of her right hand inside the jar and the palm of her left hand outside the jar. This raises the walls of the pot, thins them and expands them so that she can form a small container. Here she begins to scrape the outside of the pot with a stick, working the clay upward with the palm of her left hand inside the pot to support it as she backs around the jar in a clockwise direction. She flares the rim of the jar and smooths it. These are some larger jars formed by using this direct pull technique. These have already been fired and are ready for sale. Not far away by the edge of the main road between Abuja and the bridge at Kotankarafi, there was a much larger pottery production area. These are the results of one of the firings. The women who worked in this area were displaying their wares along the side of the road, offering them for sale to passing travelers, most of whom were, of course, Nigerian rather than strangers. Benin City is just west of the Niger River and a little ways west of the Igbo town of Ini. It has been famous for generations, for kingship rituals and for bronze sculpture. But the women of Benin City also make pottery. This woman was photographed in 1991 using the coiling technique to make small but very symmetrical and elegant earthen jars. She begins with a coil of clay, pressing the clay against the palm of her left hand. She places the new base of the jar in a low, shallow support and works around the edge of the support, continuing to press the coil of clay into her left hand. As the base of the pot is built up, she rotates it in the support until she's built it up high enough that she can begin to add coils of clay to the exterior. I'm impressed by her strength. She has obviously been doing pottery for a long, long time. At this point she's added several coils of clay and built up a nice spherical jar with a narrow opening. She then adds a coil of clay around the mouth of the jar, presses it in with her fingers, and begins to thin and expand it to form the rim of the jar. During my discussion with her, I asked her about the next generation of potters, if her own daughter would be a potter as well, and she said no, that her daughter and other younger women weren't interested in the kind of difficult and dirty work that was involved in making pottery. While I was there, her daughter visited and said she wanted to be a flight attendant on Nigerian Airlines. She then scrapes the exterior of the jar to smooth it and to expand the rim. She has scraped the exterior of the jar with a dry corncob, and walking around the pot has smoothed the rim until it's uniform and quite symmetrical. She adds the finishing touches to the exterior of the pot, which is still supported by a broken potsherd. Here are some examples of the completed pots ready for the firing. One of the most famous pottery production centers in all of Nigeria is the famous Dada compound in the northern Yoruba city of Ilorin. Pottery begins by gathering the raw clay that will be processed to make the jars and the fuel that is needed for the firing. The women of the compound who control the pottery production actually hire men to do this physical labor. They pay by the cartload for both raw clay and fuel. Just as in the more southerly Odawale compound near Ibadan, the pottery process combines two techniques, the convex mold technique and the coiling technique. As soon as the clay has been processed, it's kneaded and spread over an overturned mold jar. A mallet is used to thin it and spread it until it has completely covered the overturned jar. After it's dried for a few hours, it is carefully removed. 4 women lift the large heavy jar off of the mold and place it carefully on the ground. The new jar is so heavy that their fingers bite deeply into the rim of the new jar, and that section of the jar must then be trimmed. Wood ash is used between the mold and the fresh clay to keep the fresh clay from sticking to the mold. You can see the woman on the left is the head of the compound, and she's wearing a live snake draped around her neck. Newly formed jars are covered with damp blankets to keep them from drying too quickly and cracking. Here a woman is spreading the new clay over the mold jar using a mallet that she holds in her right hand. You can see the size of the compound and the numbers of women who work together to produce large numbers of very large jars quickly. The woman in the background has almost finished the new jar, while the woman in the foreground is still pounding out the fresh clay. Most of these large jars will be used for soaking cassava to remove the prussic acid. When prussic acid is soaked out of the cassava, it then becomes safe to process and eat. Here 2 women shift the new jar on the mold. Here a woman trims the uneven lower edge of the new jar prior to removing it from the mold. One of the oldest women in the compound specializes in making rims. There seems to be a division of labor based on age. The older a woman is, the smaller the object she creates. The younger a woman is, and the more muscular she is, the more she works at coiling, which is a job that requires a great deal of strength. 4 women bend over to lift a pot off the mold and set it aside so that it can dry and be turned right side up to continue building it using the coiling technique. This young woman specializes in coiling. She's quite muscular, she's quite skilled, she works rapidly. She uses very thick, large sausages of clay to build up the new jar, to increase its height, and then to close it in to form a narrow opening. Here she scrapes the exterior of the new jar. Just as in Ooko, you can see the junction between the part of the jar that was formed using the convex mold technique and the lighter color of the upper jar that was formed using the coiling technique. Now she smooths the rim prior to increasing its height and narrowing it. Now she forms the narrow rim. She adds an iron-rich red slip to the exterior of the pot, which will produce contrasting gray and bright red colors when the pot is fired. These jars have been decorated with slip. The firings are very, very large. Huge quantities of dried grass and palm fronds and other dried fuel are used to fire the jars in the open. Vast quantities of pottery are then shipped all over Nigeria for sale to be used for soaking cassava. Here you can see a collection of jars waiting to be fired. In the background are more jars that have already been fired. To the right is a pile of fresh clay that will be processed for forming new jars. In 1991, I visited the Odawale compound south of the enormous Nigerian city of Ibadan with my colleague Professor Charles Hines to study Yoruba pottery. The women of the Odawale compound, headed by Mrs. Sifawu Odawale, produce pots using the convex mold technique combined with the coiling technique. They produce dozens and dozens of small jars each day and fire them in an open firing in the family compound. This photograph shows the head of the family surrounded by his wives and other female relatives, his daughters. As always, the first step is to prepare the clay. The dry clay is slaked with water and then pounded up, mixed with grog or temper with pounded potsherds. Mrs. Odawale then kneads the clay to produce a clay body she can use to form the base of the pots over an overturned jar using the convex mold technique. She thins and smooths and spreads the clay over the overturned mold jar and then leaves it upside down on the ground to set up to dry, then turns it right side up and using the coiling technique increases the size, the height of the jars, backing around the jar slowly, working with her right hand inside the pot, her left hand outside the pot, using thick sausages of clay to increase the height of the new jar. In these photos, it's quite easy to see the juncture between the lower portion of the pot that was formed using the convex mold technique and the lighter colored upper portion of the jar that was formed using the coiling technique. Here are a number of almost identical jars waiting to be fired in the kiln in the background. The fuel for the firing are dried palm midribs. First, the Odawale women clean out the kiln, removing the ash from previous firings, gather potsherds that can be used to cover the firing, and then begin to place the new pots in the enclosure. One of Mrs. Odawale's daughters lights the firing, and as the flames begin to take, the charge of new pots is covered with broken potsherds, which will both hold in a little bit of the heat and help to form a blanket of hot ash around the pottery that will bake it and allow the heat to soak into the pots. There are holes around the base of the low kiln which allow palm midribs to be inserted into the fire even while the fire is going. Once the jars have reached about 600 degrees centigrade, an adequate firing temperature to oxidize them, the fire is allowed to go out and the pots are removed from the fire using long hooks or poles while they are still red hot. They're then placed on the ground in the compound to allow them to cool off before they can be shipped off to sell in the market in Ibadan.